Terrifying encounter. John faces the ghost of the West. In a small, quiet village not far from bustling Saigon, a man named John lives a humble life. On a fateful rainy night, John decides to venture out frog hunting after a storm, thinking the wet weather will help him catch more. Despite his wife's warnings and his son's reluctance, John sets out alone into the eerie fields where ghostly rumors have long persisted. Unbeknownst to him, this night would unravel into a horrifying encounter with supernatural forces. John stumbles upon a strange boy who offers to help him carry his frog catch. However, the boy's bizarre behavior and sudden transformation into a ghastly figure with blood-red eyes and a mouth filled with frog remains sends John into a frenzy of fear. As John races away, the nightmarish laughter of the creature follows him, intensifying his terror. With each step, John is haunted by more unnatural phenomena, ghostly figures, eerie sounds, and even a group of spectral rodents. The tale climaxes when John encounters the apparition of a young woman, a local legend believed to be the spirit of a murdered girl, whose haunting presence seals John's fate. The villagers later find his body lifeless, contorted in fear, as though he had seen something too terrible for words. This is a chilling story of a man who ventures out into the dark, only to be consumed by the very legends he had once dismissed as old wives' tales. Part 1. A rainy night in Longbrook. The rain pounded relentlessly against the roof of the small wooden house. Each drop a deafening thud in the stillness of the night. Outside, the storm raged, turning the marshy fields of Longbrook into a dark, waterlogged wasteland. The wind howled, and every now and then, a sharp crack of thunder echoed across the village. It was the kind of storm that sent most people scrambling to stay indoors safe and dry near the warmth of a fire. But not John. John was a simple man, a farmer by day and a frog hunter by night when the storms rolled in. For as long as he could remember, heavy rains had always meant wanting frogs. Frogs by the dozens flushed out of their hiding spots by the rising waters. To John, a night like this was an opportunity, one that he couldn't let slip away. He sat by the door, slipping his thick boots on as his wife Mary stood nearby, her arms crossed and her face lined with worry. She had been begging him not to go for the past hour, but John was stubborn. He was going, no matter what. "I don't understand why you insist on doing this in the middle of a storm," Mary said, her voice low but firm. "The frogs will still be there tomorrow morning. You don't have to go out now in this weather." John glanced at her as he pulled on his heavy coat, water resistant but worn from years of use. "The rain drives them out, Mary. They'll be back in the ground by morning," he replied, his voice calm, almost indifferent. He had no fear of the storm. To him, it was just nature doing what nature did. "I'll be back before you know it," she sighed deeply, her frustration mixing with her concern. "At least take Thomas with you," she said, looking over at their 12-year-old son, who lay fast asleep by the fireplace. "It's not safe out there by yourself. You've heard the stories." John laughed softly, shaking his head. "Stories? That's all they are. There's nothing out there but frogs, and I can handle a few frogs on my own." But Mary wasn't reassured. She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if speaking too loudly would disturb the spirits she feared. "People have seen things in those marshes, John. Strange things. Lights that don't belong to anyone. Figures that disappear when you get too close. This storm, it's different. I can feel it." John paused, his hand on the door. He turned to look at her, his face softening just a little. "You worry too much. I'll be careful. I promise." Without waiting for a response, he opened the door and stepped out into the night, the storm greeting him with a gust of wind that nearly tore the door from his hand. He pulled his hood up over his head, the rain already soaking through his coat as he trudged away from the house and into the dark, wet world beyond. The village of Longbrook quickly disappeared behind him, swallowed by the rain and the night. The marshes stretched out before him, an endless expanse of waterlogged fields and reeds that swayed wildly in the wind. The ground beneath his feet squelched with every step, his boots sinking into the mud as he made his way toward the heart of the marsh. The only light came from the lantern he carried, its weak glow barely cutting through the sheets of rain. Shadows danced on the edges of his vision, but he paid them no mind. His focus was on the frogs. He could already hear them croaking somewhere out in the darkness, their voices rising and falling with the wind. John moved deeper into the marsh, his senses heightened by the storm. The frogs were out there, just waiting to be caught. His hand tightened around the spear he carried, ready to strike as soon as he spotted one. But as he walked, a strange feeling began to creep over him, an unease that had nothing to do with the storm or the hunt. It felt as though something was watching him. He stopped, glancing around, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The marsh was still, save for the occasional rustle of reeds in the wind. There was no one here, just him, the frogs, and the rain. Shaking off the feeling, John pressed on, determined not to let his imagination get the better of him. But the further he went, the stronger the feeling grew. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and his heart began to race, though he couldn't explain why. Then he saw a figure in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain. At first John thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection of his lantern off the water. But no, it was a person. A small figure, hunched over, sitting in the middle of the marsh. John's pulse quickened. Who would be out here, in the middle of a storm like this? "Hey," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "What are you doing out here?" The figure didn't move. John frowned, moving closer, his boots splashing through the shallow water. As he approached, the figure slowly came into focus, a boy, sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, his head resting on his arms. He was soaked, his clothes clinging to his thin frame, but he didn't seem to care. He just sat there, motionless, as if the storm didn't exist at all. "Hey, kid," John called again, louder this time. "Are you okay?" Still no response. John stopped a few feet away from the boy, his lantern casting a weak glow over the scene. Something was wrong. The boy's skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his hair hung in wet strands over his face, hiding his features. He didn't even shiver, despite being drenched to the bone. John knelt down, setting his lantern on the ground beside him. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" he asked, his voice softer now, more cautious. Slowly, the boy lifted his head, his movements unnervingly slow, almost mechanical. As his face came into the light, John felt a chill run down his spine. The boy's eyes were wide and glassy, staring straight ahead with a vacant expression that sent a wave of unease washing over John. His lips were slightly parted, but no words came out. "Where are your parents?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The boy said nothing. Instead, he raised one arm slowly, deliberately, and pointed off into the distance, toward the deeper parts of the marsh. John followed the boy's gaze, squinting through the rain. Far off, barely visible through the storm, was a flickering light. It bobbed up and down, like the light of a lantern, but it was too far away to be sure. John turned back to the boy, but before he could say anything, the boy's hand fell back to his side, and he slumped forward again, his head resting on his knees, as if he had never moved at all. John stared at him for a long moment, a growing sense of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. There was something deeply wrong here. This boy, this light, none of it made sense. He stood up, picking up his lantern. "Stay here," he said, though he doubted the boy would respond. "I'll be back." The boy remained silent, his small frame hunched over in the mud. With one last glance, John turned and began to walk toward the distant light, his heart pounding in his chest. The frogs forgotten, he moved through the marsh with a growing sense of urgency, the strange light drawing him in like a moth to a flame. As he approached, the light grew brighter, flickering in and out of view as the wind whipped through the reeds. It was definitely a lantern hanging from a low branch of a tree that jutted out of the marsh, but as John drew closer, his blood ran cold. There was no one there. The lantern swayed gently in the wind, its flame flickering but steady. John stood frozen, staring at it, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had expected to find someone, a hunter, maybe, or another villager. But the marsh was empty. There was no one around for miles. And then, from behind him, came the sound, a low, wet, gurgling noise, like something rising from the depths of the marsh. John spun around, his lantern swinging wildly as his heart leapt into his throat. The boy was still there, sitting exactly where John had left him. But something was different now. The boy's head was tilted back, his face turned toward the sky, and his mouth was wide open, unnaturally wide, as if his jaw had unhinged itself. Thick, dark liquid dripped from the corners of his mouth, pooling in his lap. His eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, stared blankly ahead, and his body was perfectly still. John took a step back, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the rain anymore. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And then, without warning, the boy stood up. Part 2. The Mysterious Boy. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, but the world around John remained soaked heavy with the dampness of the storm. The marshlands, once familiar and unremarkable, had transformed into an eerie, glistening expanse of water, shadow, and strange echoes. Every step John took was met with the squelching sound of mud swallowing his boots, and the air felt unnaturally thick, as though the storm had left behind something other than rain. He could hear the frog's distant croaks rising above the low whisper of the wind. The promise of a good hunt still lingered in his mind, yet something else gnawed at his thoughts, an unsettled feeling that had been building since he left his home. It was the kind of night when strange things happen. His wife's warning echoed in his head, but John shook it off. He wasn't one to believe in the superstitions passed down through generations of villagers. Ghosts, spirits, and old legends, those were stories to scare children, not grown men like him. He was out here for frogs, not to chase shadows. His lantern flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the waterlogged fields. The reeds swayed gently in the wind, their tall, thin bodies resembling twisted figures in the darkness. John adjusted his grip on his spear, trying to focus on the hunt. But just as he was about to move further into the field, something caught his eye. At the edge of the marsh, near the base of a large oak tree, sat a figure, small, hunched, and completely still. John squinted through the misty rain, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure appeared to be a child, sitting alone, drenched from head to toe. His back was to John, his head resting on his knees as though he had been sitting there for hours. John felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. What would a boy be doing out here, alone in the middle of the marsh, in weather like this? For a brief moment, John considered walking away, continuing his hunt, and leaving the strange boy behind. But something stopped him, a sense of unease mingled with curiosity. "Hey," John called out, his voice loud in the stillness of the night. The boy didn't move. John's boots squelched in the mud as he walked closer, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air around him seemed to grow colder with every step, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He called out again, louder this time, but still the boy remained silent, his small form huddled against the tree. When John finally reached the boy, he hesitated, holding his lantern higher to get a better look. The weak, flickering light illuminated the boy's pale skin and drenched clothes. His arms were wrapped tightly around his knees, and his head was bowed, hiding his face beneath a curtain of wet, dark hair. John knelt down, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. "Hey, kid," he said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "What are you doing out here all alone? Where are your parents?" The boy remained motionless, as if he hadn't heard a word John said. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his small frame, and his skin was almost ghostly white, the kind of pallor that didn't seem natural. John's pulse quickened, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. He reached out a hand, hesitating before gently touching the boy's shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed the boy's cold, wet skin, the child stirred, but not in the way John expected. Slowly, unnervingly, the boy lifted his head, as though it took every ounce of strength in his body to do so. John's breath caught in his throat when he finally saw the boy's face. The boy's eyes were wide, far too wide, glassy, and unfocused, staring ahead without really seeing. His lips were parted slightly, but no breath came from them, no words, no sound. The expression on his face was blank, almost lifeless, and for a moment John wondered if the boy was even alive. Kid John's voice trembled, but the boy didn't respond. Instead, the child slowly raised one hand, pale and trembling, and pointed. John followed the direction of the boy's finger, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out what the child was indicating. In the distance, barely visible through the mist and rain, was a faint, flickering light. It was far off, deeper into the marsh, where the reeds grew taller and the water turned darker. The light bobbed up and down like a lantern swaying in the wind, but John couldn't see anyone holding it. It was just there, floating in the distance, beckoning. John turned back to the boy, his heart racing. The child's hand had fallen back to his side, and he had slumped over once more, his head resting on his knees as though he had never moved at all. The sight sent a chill through John's bones. He stood up slowly, his gaze shifting between the boy and the distant light. There was something deeply wrong about all of this. A strange boy, alone in the marsh, pointing toward an eerie light that had no visible source. None of it made sense. For a moment, John considered turning back, abandoning the hunt and heading home. But then he shook his head, forcing himself to think rationally. The boy could be lost, and the light could belong to someone else, a villager, perhaps, or another hunter. He couldn't just leave the child out here in the rain. He had to investigate, if only to find out if there was someone nearby who could help. "I'll be back," John muttered, though he wasn't sure if the boy could even hear him. The child remained silent, unmoving, as John turned away and began walking toward the distant light. The rain had picked up again, turning the ground beneath John's feet into a thick, sucking mud that threatened to pull him down with every step. His lantern swung in his hand, casting long, jagged shadows across the reeds. The frogs' croaking grew louder, more chaotic, as though the creatures sensed something in the air that John could not. As he moved deeper into the marsh, the light ahead seemed to grow dimmer, flickering as though it was struggling to stay lit. John quickened his pace, his boots splashing through the water, his breath coming in short, anxious bursts. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, pressing down on him like a heavy weight. When John finally reached the spot where he had seen the light, he stopped dead in his tracks. The light was gone. He stood there, panting, his eyes scanning the dark marsh around him. The wind howled through the reeds, whipping them back and forth, but there was no sign of the light, no sign of anyone at all. For a moment, John wondered if he had imagined it. Perhaps the storm had played tricks on his eyes, or maybe the light had been nothing more than a reflection on the water. But no, he had seen it. He was sure of it. A cold knot of fear tightened in his chest. He turned back the way he had come, his heart pounding in his ears. The boy. He had to check on the boy. John hurried back through the marsh, the lantern's weak glow barely cutting through the rain. His footsteps echoed strangely in the stillness, as though the ground itself was amplifying the sound. When he reached the spot where he had left the boy, he stopped short. The boy was gone. The patch of mud where the child had been sitting was undisturbed, as though no one had ever been there. John's pulse quickened, his mind racing. He spun in a slow circle, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the marsh was empty. The only sound was the wind and the steady croak of the frogs. John took a step back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The boy hadn't moved. He had been sitting there, motionless, just moments ago. But now, there was no trace of him. Suddenly, from somewhere behind him, came a low, wet sound, a gurgling noise, like something rising up from the depths of the marsh. John froze. Slowly, he turned around, his lantern casting a small circle of light around him. The reeds swayed violently in the wind, their long, slender bodies bending under the force of the storm. And then, in the distance, he saw it again. The light. It flickered once more, this time closer, much closer than before. John's breath caught in his throat. The air around him felt thick and suffocating, the shadows stretching and contorting into grotesque shapes. He took a step back, his heart racing, But before he could make another move, the gurgling sound grew louder. Something was coming. John turned and ran. His boots sank into the mud with every step, the cold, wet earth dragging him down as he fought to move faster. The lantern swung wildly in his hand, its light barely illuminating the path ahead. The wind howled in his ears, and the sound of the frogs grew deafening, their croaks overlapping into a cacophony of noise. Behind him, the gurgling sound followed, getting closer with every second. John's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. He could feel the cold fingers of fear wrapping around him, pulling him down into the darkness. His legs burned with the effort of running, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not with that thing behind him. The light flickered ahead once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a faint, distant glow. It was right there, just beyond the reeds, hovering in the air like a ghostly beacon. John skidded to a halt, his lungs burning, his mind racing. The light was closer than ever, and yet there was still no one there. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, pale, drenched, and completely still. The boy. He stood in the exact same position as before, his head slightly tilted, his eyes wide and unblinking. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his small, frail frame, but he showed no signs of discomfort, no signs of life. John's breath hitched in his throat. He took a step back, but his feet felt heavy, as if they were sinking into the earth. The boy's glassy eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, John felt as though the world had frozen around him. Then, the boy smiled. It was not a smile of joy, nor was it a smile of warmth. It was a twisted, unnatural grin, the kind that made John's blood run cold. The boy's lips parted, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, far too long for any child. John's heart raced as he turned and bolted back into the marsh, his mind screaming one thing: run. Part 3. A haunting transformation. The rain had tapered off, leaving behind a dense, suffocating mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. The air was thick and cold, almost biting against John's skin as he trudged back through the flooded fields. His heart was still pounding from the strange encounter with the boy, and the eerie light that had vanished just as suddenly as it had appeared weighed heavily on his mind. John couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in his gut. The boy, something about him wasn't right. The pale skin, the blank stare, the strange, slow movements. It was as though the child had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare and placed into the real world where he didn't belong. John had seen his fair share of strange things in the marshlands, but nothing like this. Maybe he's just lost, John muttered to himself, trying to dismiss the unease that crawled up his spine. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. His instincts told him to leave, to go home and forget he had ever seen the boy. But something else, some twisted sense of responsibility, urged him to check on the child one last time. He quickened his pace, the water sloshing around his boots as he neared the spot where he had left the boy. The mist swirled around him, making it harder to see, and the silence was unnerving. The frogs had stopped croaking, their once deafening chorus now replaced by an oppressive, eerie stillness. Even the wind had stilled, as if the entire marsh was holding its breath. John swallowed hard, gripping the lantern tightly as its dim light flickered in the gloom. He could just make out the silhouette of the boy, still hunched over at the base of the tree where he had been sitting. His small, drenched figure seemed even more fragile now, almost blending into the mist as if he were part of it. Something was wrong. The stillness of the boy's body was unnatural, as though he were a statue frozen in time. John's breath quickened as he drew closer, his boots sinking deeper into the mud with every step. "Hey," Kid John called out softly, though his voice sounded weaker than he intended. The boy didn't move, not a twitch. His head remained bowed, his arms still wrapped tightly around his knees. The sight sent a shiver down John's spine. The mist thickened around him, and for a moment John felt as though he was stepping into another world, one that was darker, colder, and far more dangerous than the marsh he knew. His grip tightened around the lantern as he crouched down, squinting through the fog to get a better look at the boy's face. The faint light of the lantern flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the boy's pale, sickly skin. Then, without warning, the boy moved. It was slow at first, barely perceptible, but John's heart lurched in his chest as he saw the boy's head begin to rise. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as though some unseen force was pulling him upward. John's throat tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. Kid, the boy's head lifted higher, revealing his face in the dim light of the lantern, and John's blood ran cold. The boy's eyes were wide, far too wide, their once glassy surface now glowing with an unnatural, malevolent red. His mouth, which had been tightly shut before, was now grotesquely open, so wide that it stretched his jaw inhumanly, as though it had been unhinged. The inside of his mouth was a deep, sickening red, filled with thick, dark blood that dripped from his lips and down his chin, staining his already pale skin, but it wasn't just blood that filled his mouth. John gagged as he realized what else was inside. The remains of frogs, half chewed, twisted corpses were crammed into the boy's gaping maw. Their slimy, mangled bodies hung from his lips, their small limbs twitching with the last remnants of life. Bones jutted out from their broken forms, and the smell, oh God, the smell was rancid, like rot and decay mixed with the sickly sweetness of blood. John stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern as a wave of nausea hit him. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight, even as his mind screamed for him to run. The boy, no, this thing in front of him wasn't human anymore. It couldn't be. The boy's eyes locked onto John's, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment everything seemed to freeze. The world around them they missed, the marsh, the distant trees faded into the background, leaving only the boy and John, connected by a gaze that chilled John to his very core. And then the boy smiled. It was a grotesque, twisted smile, one that stretched his already deformed mouth even wider. His teeth sharp, jagged, and stained with blood glistened in the dim light, and his tongue, blackened and swollen, slithered over the remains of the frogs like a snake severing its prey. John's heart pounded in his chest as pure, unadulterated fear took hold of him. This was no boy. This was something far worse, something dark and ancient, hiding beneath the guise of a child. Every instinct in John's body screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as he stared into the boy's glowing red eyes. The boy, or whatever had taken his form, stood up slowly, its limbs moving with an unnatural, jerky motion. Its neck twisted at an odd angle, and its bones creaked audibly as it straightened. The sound was sickening, like dry wood snapping in a fire, and John flinched, his stomach turning. The boy took a step toward him. John stumbled back, finally breaking free from the paralysis that had gripped him. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to back away, but his boots slipped in the mud, sending him crashing to the ground. He tried to scramble to his feet, but the boy was already moving closer, its movements quick and erratic, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Its eyes never left John's, that sinister, twisted grin still plastered across his face. John's mind raced as he struggled to get up, the cold mud clinging to his clothes and weighing him down. He could hear the boy's labored, wet breathing as it approached, each breath sounding like a death rattle deep in its throat. He was only feet away now, close enough that John could see every grotesque detail, the dried blood that caked its lips, the frog's remains dangling from its mouth, the way its skin seemed to sag, as if it were wearing a human mask that didn't quite fit. John's heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear anything else. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, desperate to put some distance between himself and the monster in front of him. But no matter how far he tried to move, the boy followed, its glowing red eyes locked onto him with a hunger that sent chills through his veins. "Stay back," John shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The boy didn't listen. It only moved faster, its limbs twitching and convulsing as though it were struggling to maintain control over its own body. The grotesque smile widened, and the boy's mouth opened even further, impossibly wide now, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. John reached for his spear, but his hands were trembling so violently that he could barely grip it. He felt the cold metal beneath his fingers, and with a surge of desperation, he swung it wildly in front of him, hoping to keep the creature at bay. The boy's head snapped to the side with a sickening crack, and for a moment it seemed to hesitate, its twisted smile faltering. But then it laughed. The sound was not human. It was a low, guttural noise that seemed to reverberate through the air, filling the marsh with an oppressive, suffocating weight. The boy's head twitched again, and its body jerked forward, the laughter growing louder, more manic, as it moved closer to John. John's mind raced. This thing, it wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a spirit. It was something worse. Something ancient, dark, and full of malice. He had to get away. He had to run. With a burst of adrenaline, John scrambled to his feet and bolted. His boots slipped and slid in the mud, but he didn't care. He ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The boy's laughter followed him, echoing through the marsh like the cry of a predator hunting its prey. John's lungs burned with the effort of running, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't look back. He knew that if he did, if he slowed for even a second, that thing would be upon him. The trees blurred around him as he sprinted through the field, his legs burning with exhaustion. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts swirling in his head, but one stood out among the chaos. What the hell was that thing? The village lights were just ahead, faint but visible through the mist. John pushed himself harder, his boots splashing through the shallow water as he neared the safety of the village. But as he drew closer to the village, something felt wrong. The light that had once seemed so reassuring now flickered weakly, as if the storm had taken the life out of them too. John's breath was coming in ragged gasps, the wet fabric of his clothes clinging to his skin as he ran. But even as exhaustion gnawed at his limbs, he forced himself onward, his mind consumed by the terror he had left behind. The boy or whatever that thing had been was no longer just an unsettling memory. Its grotesque, twisted smile, the blood-soaked mouth filled with frogs, the red glow in its eyes, those images burned themselves into John's brain, replaying over and over with each step. But what still was the sound? The laugh. That awful, inhuman sound that had followed him, echoing through the marsh like the howl of something not of this world. As John neared the edge of the village, he glanced over his shoulder for the first time since he had started running. His lantern light bobbed up and down as his feet splashed through the shallow pools of water that dotted the path. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see if that thing was still following him. But his terror compelled him. The mist had grown even thicker now, and the marsh behind him seemed to stretch on forever. He squinted, his breath catching in his throat as he searched for any sign of movement, any hint of that grinning face. Nothing. For a brief moment, John allowed himself to hope. Maybe he had outrun it. Maybe the boy had given up the chase, retreating into the darkness from which he had come. But then, just as he was about to turn back toward the village, he saw it. A faint flicker of red in the distance. The same malevolent glow he had seen in the boy's eyes. It was far off, barely visible through the fog, but it was there, and it was moving slowly, methodically, as if it was stalking him. John's heart leapt into his throat, his legs moving on pure instinct as he ran harder, faster, toward the village. He couldn't think. He couldn't stop. He could only run. The village was closed now, the faint glow of lanterns dotting the outskirts like tiny beacons of safety. But even as he approached the familiar sight of home, something felt off. The village seemed wrong. It was too quiet. The usual sounds of night dogs barking, distant voices, the creaking of old wooden doors were absent. All John could hear was the sound of his own footsteps, his own ragged breathing, and the faint squelching of the marsh beneath his boots. He stumbled into the main road of the village, his chest heaving with exertion. The houses loomed out of the mist like shadows, their windows dark and lifeless. John slowed, looking around in confusion. Where was everyone? "Help," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Somebody help me." But no one answered. His voice seemed to vanish into the mist, swallowed up by the silence that hung over the village like a heavy fog. John's stomach twisted in knots. Something was terribly wrong. He glanced back at the marsh, but the red glow had disappeared. That thing, it was still out there waiting, watching. He couldn't let his guard down, not now. Not when he was so close to safety. With trembling hands he lifted his lantern higher, scanning the houses around him. The warm light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the narrow street. He had to find someone. Anyone. His feet moved almost of their own accord as he stumbled toward the nearest house, his mind racing. He pounded on the door with all the strength he had left. "Please," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let me in. There's something out there. It's coming for me." No response. The house remained silent, its windows dark and unwelcoming. John's panic swelled. He moved to the next house, his fist slamming against the wooden door. "Help. Please, I need help." Again, nothing. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. It was as if the entire village had been abandoned, as if everyone had vanished into thin air. His heart pounded in his ears, his mind struggling to make sense of the situation. Had they all fled? Had the villagers somehow known what was out there in the marsh waiting for him? John's head spun with questions, but there were no answers, only the suffocating silence. Just as John was about to move to the next house, a faint sound broke the stillness. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but as John turned his head, his blood ran cold. Laughter. That same sickening, inhuman laughter he had heard in the marsh. But it wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from within the village. John's entire body went rigid with fear. Slowly he turned, his heart hammering in his chest. At the far end of the street, standing in the shadows beneath the eaves of a building, was a figure. It was the boy. Or at least it looked like the boy. His small, frail frame was hunched over, his clothes soaked through and clinging to his pale skin. His face was hidden in shadow, but John knew. He knew that if he got closer, he would see those red, glowing eyes staring back at him. That twisted, grotesque smile. The boy took a step forward, his limbs moving with that same jerky, unnatural motion. His head tilted to the side, and even from this distance, John could see the blood dripping from his mouth, staining the ground at his feet. John stumbled back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The boy took another step, then another, his footsteps slow but deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. The laughter grew louder, more manic, filling the street with its terrible sound. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls of the houses, bouncing around in John's skull until he thought he might go mad from the sound of it. And then the boy spoke. His voice was low, guttural, and wrong in every way. It didn't sound like a child's voice. It didn't even sound human. John the boy hissed, his red eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Come closer." John's breath hitched in his throat, his skin prickling with fear. How did it know his name? The boy stepped forward again, his smile widening. "Don't be afraid." But John was afraid, he was terrified. His entire body shook with fear, and his mind screamed at him to move, to run, to get away from this nightmare. But his legs refused to obey. "Closer," the boy whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "I want to see you." John's legs finally responded, but instead of running forward or away, they wobbled, and he collapsed to the ground. His knees hit the cold, wet earth with a thud, and his lantern clattered beside him, the light flickering weakly. The boy laughed again, a sound so wrong, so twisted, it made John want to scream. But his voice had left him, his mouth hung open, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but no sound escaped his lips. The boy was almost upon him now, his red eyes glowing brighter in the mist. His smile had stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the faint light of the lantern. "John," the boy whispered, leaning down toward him, his breath cold and foul against John's face. "You should have listened to the stories." John's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He tried to crawl backward to put some distance between himself and the creature in front of him, but his body was frozen with terror. The boy's smile grew wider still, his mouth now impossibly large, his teeth glinting like daggers. And then, with one final, sickening laugh, the boy lunged. John barely had time to react. He threw his hands up in a desperate attempt to shield himself, but the boy was too fast, too strong. Cold, sharp teeth sank into his flesh, and John screamed a raw, primal sound that echoed through the empty village. The pain was blinding, searing through his body like fire, but it was a terror that overwhelmed him. The feeling of being consumed, of being devoured by something so utterly inhuman, was more than his mind could bear. And as the boy's glowing red eyes stared into his, John knew with sickening certainty that there would be no escape. The last thing John heard before the darkness claimed him was the boy's voice, a soft, mocking whisper now. "You're one of us," then everything went black. Part 4. Chased by laughter. The sound of rain was fading now, replaced by the deafening pounding of John's own heart. His lungs burned and his legs felt like they were made of lead, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not with that thing behind him. The boy's laughter, it was everywhere. Twisted, maniacal, inhuman. It echoed through the mist, bouncing off the waterlogged trees and reeds, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. John's mind was clouded with fear, his thoughts chaotic as they raced ahead of him, just like his feet desperately seeking escape. He had been running for what felt like hours. The marsh stretched out endlessly before him, its slick, muddy ground threatening to swallow his every step. His boots sank into the cold muck, slowing him down, making his progress agonizingly slow. The fog clung to him like a suffocating blanket, growing thicker with every passing moment, blurring the edges of his vision. But none of it was as terrifying as the sound of laughter. "Come back," John the voice hissed through the fog. It was soft, almost sing-song, as though the boy were calling out playfully. John's heart skipped a beat. How did it know his name? No, it wasn't real. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He had to get away. He had to keep moving. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale sharp and painful. The world around him felt like it was closing in, pressing down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. The laughter followed him, growing louder and more deranged with every step. It wasn't just a boy's laugh anymore. It was something darker, something twisted like the mocking cry of a predator toying with its prey. It made John's skin crawl, sending chills racing down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with panic, expecting to see that pale face, those glowing red eyes, but there was nothing but the swirling mist and the dark, twisted shapes of the trees looming overhead. John's breath hitched. How was that possible? The laughter was so close it felt as though the boy's mouth was right at his ear, whispering that eerie, deranged chuckle. And yet, when he looked back, there was no one, no child, no movement, just the mist. He forced his legs to move faster, his body screaming in protest. His muscles ached, his throat burned, and his mind was filled with the incessant, unrelenting sound of that laughter. It was maddening. The kind of laugh that could drive a person insane. The kind of laugh that wormed its way into your soul, a twisted mockery of every human emotion. The marsh was darker now, more oppressive. The lantern's dim light flickered as John stumbled forward, barely illuminating the path ahead. The reeds seemed to grow taller, stretching toward him like skeletal fingers, grasping at his clothes, snagging on his skin. The mist curled around him, thicker, heavier, suffocating. It clung to him like a living thing, cold and wet, seeping into his bones. "Don't look back," John whispered to himself, his voice trembling. Don't look back, but the temptation was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at him to look, to see if the boy or whatever that thing was gaining on him. He could feel it, the presence thought it was close. Too close. John choked on his fear, his mind spiraling into panic. His breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps now, and his vision blurred from the tears of terror that welled in his eyes. He was on the verge of collapse, but the laughter was still there, digging into his psyche like claws. It was relentless, growing louder, more maniacal with every second. Finally, against his better judgment, John gave in to the overwhelming need to look. He glanced over his shoulder and saw nothing but the path behind him was empty. There was no boy, no twisted creature lurking in the shadows. Just the endless marsh, the reeds swaying gently in the wind, and the mist curling like smoke across the wet ground. But the laughter was still there, haunting him, mocking him, closing in on him. Impossible, John gasped, his voice barely a whisper. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root hidden beneath the mud, sending him crashing to the ground. He lay there for a moment, his body trembling, covered in cold, wet earth. His lantern had fallen from his grasp, its light flickering weakly in the mud a few feet away. John's hands trembled as he reached for the lantern, his fingers numb with cold and fear. His entire body felt like it was shutting down, his mind on the verge of breaking. But he forced himself to move. He had to keep moving. As he pushed himself up from the ground, he froze. The laughter had stopped. The marsh had gone deathly silent, the only sound his own ragged breathing. The oppressive stillness weighed down on him, thicker than the fog. John held his breath, straining to listen. For a brief, fleeting moment, hope flickered in his chest. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been chasing him had lost interest, or had simply vanished into the night. But then, from somewhere deep within the mist, he heard it. A soft, wet squelch, like footsteps in the mud. It was still out there. John's pulse raced. He scrambled to his feet, his fingers closing around the handle of the lantern. His mind screamed at him to run, to keep going, but his body was frozen with fear. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the footsteps growing closer, each one slow and deliberate. Squish, the sound was growing louder, closer, but still no one was there. Get a grip, John. He hissed to himself, shaking his head. It's not real. It's not real. But no matter how many times he told himself that, it didn't change the fact that something was out there. Something was hunting him. The footsteps grew faster, the sound of them squelching through the mud becoming erratic, frantic. John felt his legs move before his mind caught up. He was running again, his chest tightened with each breath, but the fear that clung to him like a second skin pushed him forward, faster and faster. The laughter returned, more deranged than before. It was everywhere inside his head, reverberating through the ground, crawling up his spine. It was coming from within him, laughing at his own terror, feeding on it. Faster, John urged himself, his voice hoarse, almost breaking. Faster, his feet splashed through the mud, each step feeling heavier, more labored. His legs burned with exertion, his heart hammering wildly in his chest. But no matter how hard he pushed himself, no matter how fast he ran, the presence was always there, lingering just behind him, taunting him. He could feel it now, the icy, malevolent force pressing against his back, its cold breath on the nape of his neck. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could fight or escape from. It was everywhere. John's mind teetered on the edge of madness as the night grew darker, more oppressive. The reeds that had once swayed gently now seemed to close in on him, their long, spindly bodies twisting into grotesque shapes, like arms reaching out to pull him down into the mud. The trees loomed overhead, their branches bending and creaking as though alive, watching, waiting. John couldn't tell how far he had run, or where he was anymore. The village was a distant memory, swallowed up by the mist and the darkness. There was no escape, no safe place to run to. The marsh had become a labyrinth, a prison with no way out. And still, the laughter followed him, relentless, inescapable. It was louder now, deafening in its intensity, as if the thing chasing him was growing stronger the more he feared it. The more he ran, the closer it got. John's vision blurred as exhaustion overtook him. His legs felt like they were about to give out. His lungs burned with the effort of breathing, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He had to get away. But then, through the fog, John saw something up ahead, a light dot. For a brief moment, hope surged through him. Was it the village? Had he finally made it back? His heart leapt in his chest as he pushed himself harder, ignoring the searing pain in his legs, the terror clawing at his mind. But as he drew closer, the light flickered, dimming for just a moment, and then John realized with a sickening jolt of horror that it wasn't the village. It was the same light he had seen in the marsh, the same eerie, flickering lantern that had led him to the boy. John skidded to a halt, his breath catching in his throat as his mind raced. No, it couldn't be E. He had run so far, so fast. How could he have circled back? The laughter grew louder, more manic, filling the air around him with its twisted, mocking cry. The light flickered again, and this time a figure stepped out of the mist dot. It was the boy. His pale, dripping form stood just beyond the flickering light, his red eyes glowing in the darkness, his grotesque smile wider than ever. His mouth hung open, the remains of frog spilling out, blood dripping from his lips. John's legs finally gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving with sobs of terror. His lantern flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The boy took a step forward, and then another. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body was frozen with fear, his mind shattered by the horror of it all. The last thing John heard before the boy's laughter consumed him entirely was a soft, mocking whisper, "You can't run from me, John." And then everything went dark. Part 5. The Spectral Rats. The marsh was quiet, too quiet. For the first time since John had begun running, the eerie laughter was gone. The oppressive weight of the boy's mocking presence had lifted, replaced by an almost eerie calm that seeped into the night. John, gasping for breath, stumbled to a halt and hunched over, hands on his knees, panting, his lungs burning like fire. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he fought to calm his racing heart. Had he finally escaped? The thought crossed his mind, fragile and uncertain. The boy, that thing, was nowhere to be seen. The only sound was the soft rustling of the marsh's tall reeds in a gentle breeze, the occasional drip of rainwater falling from the branches overhead. The fog had thinned, though it still clung stubbornly to the ground, swirling lazily around his feet. John straightened, his muscles trembling from exhaustion, and wiped the cold sweat from his brow. His clothes clung to his skin, soaked through with rain and mud. His body was screaming for rest, but the fear hadn't fully left him. It was still there, gnawing at the back of his mind, urging him to stay alert, to keep moving. He couldn't shake the sense of dread that lingered, like a shadow at the edges of his vision. The laughter might have stopped, but that didn't mean he was safe. Not yet. Something wasn't right. He picked up his lantern from where it had fallen, the weak flame inside barely illuminating the few feet of ground in front of him. The fog seemed thicker here, as though the night itself were conspiring to keep him blind, disoriented. The village was still out there somewhere, but every direction looked the same now. The marsh was a mazy, twisting and turning, with no clear path ahead. A low growl pierced the silence. John's heart lurched. His body froze, adrenaline surging back through his veins. The growl was deep and guttural, unmistakably predatory, and it came from somewhere close, too close. He spun around, his lantern casting shaky beams of light across the muddy ground, but saw nothing except the dense fog and the tall, swaying reeds. His pulse quickened, his eyes scanning the darkness. Another growl, this time from behind him. John turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. The fog parted just enough to reveal movement, small, dark shapes slithering through the underbrush, barely visible but unmistakably there. Rats. At first he thought they were just ordinary marsh rats, scurrying through the muck like they always did after a heavy rain. But as the mist shifted and his lantern's light flickered across the ground, he realized with growing horror that these weren't just rats. They were enormous. The creatures emerged from the shadows one by one, their bodies grotesquely large, easily the size of dogs. Their fur was matted and slick with mud, clinging to their skeletal frames. But it was their eyes that sent a jolt of terror through John's chest, glowing, crimson red, like burning embers in the dark. Their gaze was fixed on him, unblinking, predatory. John took an involuntary step back, his boots squelching in the mud. The rats began to circle him, their movements slow and deliberate, their glowing eyes never leaving his. A chorus of low growls filled the air, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. The rats bared their teeth, sharp and glistening, saliva dripping from their snarling mouths. John's heart raced. His hand tightened around the lantern's handle, the flickering light casting erratic shadows across the marsh. He tried to back away, but the rats moved with him, closing in, their glowing eyes narrowing as they sensed his fear. One of the creatures let out a high-pitched screech, its body tensing as it crouched low to the ground, preparing to lunge. John's breath hitched. He raised the lantern in front of him, the only barrier between him and the advancing horde. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling. The rats didn't flinch. They didn't even blink. Instead, their growls deepened, their circle tightening around him. John's mind raced. What the hell were these things? They weren't like any rats he had ever seen. They weren't natural. Their eyes, they looked too much like the boy's. That same malevolent red glow. That same unnerving intensity, as if they were seeing right through him, into his soul. John's hand shook as he waved the lantern back and forth, trying to keep the rats at bay. His breath came in short, panic bursts, his heart thundering in his chest. He needed to do something. Anything, Doc. "Go away," he shouted again, more desperate this time. One of the larger rats snapped its jaws, the sound sharp and menacing, and took a step forward, its claws digging into the wet earth. John stumbled back, his foot catching on a root, sending him crashing to the ground. The lantern slipped from his grasp, rolling away in the mud. Its flame flickered weakly, barely holding on. John scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his ears, but the rats were already closing in. Their growls grew louder, more frenzied, as if they could smell his fear. The largest rat, its eyes burning like fire, snarled and lunged toward him, its sharp teeth bared. John instinctively threw his arms up, bracing for the impact, but the rat stopped just short of him, its jaws snapping shut mere inches from his face. He could feel its hot, rancid breath on his skin, could see the glistening blood on his teeth. His body froze, paralyzed with terror. The rat's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The world faded around them, leaving only the creature's glowing red gaze and the sharp, unmistakable sense of malevolence that radiated from it. Then, without warning, the rat stepped back. Its growls quieted, its eyes narrowing as it stared at him. The other rats followed suit, their snarls dying down as they began to back away, their glowing eyes still fixed on him. John blinked, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The rats, they were leaving, but before he could react, the rats vanished. It was as if they had never been there. One moment they were surrounding him, their growls filling the air, their sharp teeth inches from his skin, and the next they were gone. The fog swallowed them up, erasing their presence from the marsh, leaving John standing alone in the mud, his body trembling with shock. John's breath came in shaky gasps, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He stumbled forward, grabbing the lantern from where it lay in the mud, the weak flame still flickering inside. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely hold it steady. He looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. The fog was thicker now, swirling in lazy spirals, obscuring the edges of the marsh. The rats were gone, vanished as if they had never existed at all. But the sense of unease remained. The oppressive weight of the night pressed down on him, suffocating, as though the marsh itself was alive and watching him. John took a shaky step forward, his legs weak, his mind reeling. What the hell was happening? First the boy, now these rats. None of this made sense. The world around him felt warped, twisted like a nightmare that refused to end. The silence that followed the rat's disappearance was deafening. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made John's skin crawl, his every instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. He could feel it, the presence. Something was still there, lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. John's breath hitched as he stumbled forward, his eyes darting frantically through the fog. He had to get out of the marsh. He had to find the village. but no matter how hard he tried to focus, every direction looked the same. The reeds, the mud, the twisted trees, they all blurred together in the thick mist, turning the marsh into an endless maze. There was no path, no sign of safety, only the oppressive darkness that stretched out before him, waiting to swallow him whole. His hands tightened around the lantern as he took another step forward, his legs heavy with exhaustion. He was lost, completely and utterly lost. And then, from somewhere deep within the fog, came the laughter. It started out soft, barely more than a whisper, but John's heart sank the moment he heard it. That twisted, deranged laughter, the boy's laughter, it was back. John's body went cold. His fingers clenched around the lantern, his breath coming in shallow, panic bursts. No. Not again, thought he stumbled forward, his feet slipping in the mud as he tried to run, but his legs were too weak, his muscles burning with fatigue. The laughter grew louder, more mocking, more manic, as though the boy was toying with him, enjoying his fear dot. John's vision blurred, his head spinning with exhaustion and terror. He had to keep going, he had to get away. But every step felt heavier than the last, the marsh pulling him down, dragging him deeper into its grasp. The laughter echoed around him, filling the air with its cruel, taunting sound. John's chest tightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps as his mind spiraled into panic. He couldn't escape Dob, not from this. Not from whatever malevolent force had taken hold of the night. The rats had disappeared, but the true horror was only just beginning. As the laughter closed in around him, John realized with a sickening certainty that he was never truly alone. The marsh, the fog, the night itself, they were all part of something far more sinister, something ancient and malevolent. And it wasn't going to let him go, not yet, not ever. Part 6. The Ghostly Woman. The laughter still echoed in John's mind, each mocking cackle pounding like a drum against his temples. His heart raced in time with his ragged breathing as he stumbled through the fog-choked marsh. The weight of exhaustion was bearing down on him, but fear was an even heavier burden. He didn't know how much longer he could run. His body screamed for rest, but his mind was consumed by a single thought: keep moving. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around him like a living thing, alive with whispers he couldn't quite understand. His lantern was barely more than a flickering ember now, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Every step he took felt like it was sinking deeper into the mire, the marsh trying to pull him down, drag him under. John's legs burned with every step, his chest tight with the effort of breathing. He didn't know where he was anymore. The village felt like a distant memory, and he wasn't even sure if he was heading in the right direction. But the terror that chased him, the boy's laughter, the glowing eyes of the spectral rats, was too much. Anything was better than stopping. Suddenly, the laughter faded, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world had been muted. The absence of sound was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. John slowed his pace, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, more wrong than it had been before. The air around him felt colder, the mist more oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. His skin prickled with unease as he strained to hear anything in the quiet, but all he could hear was the steady thudding of his heart in his ears. And then, through the haze of the fog, John saw her. She stood motionless in the distance, barely more than a shadow at first, her long flowing hair cascading down her back like a river of black ink. The pale glow of the moonlight pierced through the fog, just enough to illuminate her face, a face John immediately recognized, even though it had been years since he'd last seen it. It was the ghost of the girl who had been murdered in the village long ago. The legend of her tragic death was whispered by everyone, a story told to scare children and warn travelers not to wander too far from the village at night. But John had never believed the old tales. He had thought it was just a story, a ghost story to keep people from staying out too late. But now, as he stared at her hollow eyes, he knew it was no story. Her face was unnaturally pale, almost glowing in the airy moonlight, her skin so white it looked as though it had never seen the sun. Her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were locked onto him, unblinking and cold. They bore into him with a gaze that sent ice shooting down his spine, freezing him in place. John's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't look away from her. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there staring at her. But his body refused to obey. His legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, his muscles locked in place by some unseen force. The ghostly woman floated toward him, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. Her feet never touched the ground, she hovered just above the earth, her long hair billowing around her in an unnatural breeze that John couldn't feel. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustle of fabric, just a silent, terrifying glide of a being not bound by the laws of the living. John's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. This can't be real. This isn't happening, but no matter how much he tried to convince himself, there was no denying the reality of the ghostly figure drawing nearer. The closer she came, the colder the air around him became, biting into his skin like icy claws. His breath fogged in front of him, and his fingers grew numb as he clutched the handle of the lantern with white-knuckled desperation. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Please don't." But the ghostly woman didn't stop. She didn't blink. Her hollow eyes, dark and empty, were locked onto his with an intensity that made John's stomach twist. He could feel her gaze boring into him, stripping away every layer of his being, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. His legs trembled, his body aching with the effort of holding itself upright, but he couldn't move. It was as though the air around him had thickened, solidifying into an invisible cage that trapped him in place. The cold grew sharper, more painful, sinking deep into his bones. His teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. The ghost was only a few feet away now. Her pale face seemed to glow with an unnatural light, her lips parted ever so slightly, as though she were about to speak, but no sound came from her. Her empty eyes were the only thing that spoke, and they screamed with a silent agony that made John's heart race. He wanted to close his eyes, to shut out the sight of her, but he couldn't. Her gaze held him captive, forcing him to stare into those endless voids where her eyes should have been. He could feel the weight of her sorrow, her pain, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. It was as though the very air around them was thick with the remnants of her grief. As she drew closer, John's breath hitched. He could see the faint outlines of handprints around her neck, dark bruises marring the pale skin. His stomach churned with the sudden, sickening realization of what they were, the marks of her death, or the marks left by the man who had strangled her all those years ago. The legend said that she had been murdered by a jealous lover, her life stolen from her in a fit of rage. But her spirit had never found peace. It was said she wandered the marshes at night, searching for anyone to take her place, to share in her suffering. John's heart pounded in his chest, his mind screaming at him to move, to do something, anything to escape. But the woman's gaze held him like chains, and he couldn't break free. She stopped just inches from him, her cold, lifeless breath brushing against his skin. John's entire body went rigid with fear. He could see every detail of her face, now the translucent skin stretched too tight over her bones, the dark hollows beneath her eyes, the faint, ghostly shimmer that surrounded her like a veil. Her lips, pale and cracked, moved ever so slightly, as though she were whispering something just out of his hearing. John's throat tightened. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tried to make sense of the movements of her lips. She was saying something, but the words, if they were words, were lost to the wind. Suddenly, the ghost's hand shot out faster than John could react. Her cold, bony fingers wrapped around his wrist, their grip impossibly strong despite her frail appearance. John gasped, the icy touch sending a jolt of terror through his entire body. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to darken, the shadows within them growing deeper, more menacing. Her fingers tightened around his wrist, pulling him closer, her face mere inches from his now. The cold radiating from her was unbearable, sinking into his skin, his muscles, his bones. And then she spoke. Her voice was a hollow whisper, barely more than a breath, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Why? Didn't you have me?" John's blood ran cold. The words echoed in his mind, a desperate, sorrowful plea that made his heart ache with guilt. His mouth went dry, his voice failing him as he tried to respond. I didn't thought the ghost tightened her grip, her eyes narrowing. You knew, and you did nothing. John's chest tightened. He didn't understand what she meant. He hadn't known her when she was alive. He had heard the stories, sure, but he had never met her. He had never been involved in her death. Why was she accusing him? I didn't know, he cried, his voice shaking. I swear I didn't know. The ghost's expression didn't change. Her hollow eyes remained fixed on his, unblinking, unfeeling. Her grip on his wrist tightened further, the cold seeping deeper into his skin, making his bones ache with the chill. You all knew, she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow, but none of you saved me. John's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling into panic. He had to get away, he had to break free, but the ghost's grip was too strong, her presence too overwhelming. His body was shutting down, the cold sapping his strength, his will to fight. Tears welled in his eyes as he struggled against the ghost's hold. Please, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Please, let me go for a moment. The ghost's expression softened, her eyes losing some of their intensity. But then, just as quickly, her face twisted into something darker, something filled with rage and pain. No, she hissed, her voice cooler than the night around them. You're coming with me. John's heart slammed against his ribs as the ghost began to pull him toward the marsh, her grip unrelenting. The cold intensified, freezing his limbs, making every movement painful. He tried to resist, to pull away, but it was useless. She was too strong. The marsh seemed to open up before him. A dark, endless void waiting to swallow him whole. And as John was dragged closer to the edge of the marsh, a single thought echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. This is where I die, dot, as if sensing his surrender. The ghost smiled, a cold, empty smile that held no warmth, no life. And in that moment, John knew there was no escape. But then, just as the darkness of the marsh began to close in around him, something changed. The ghost's grip faltered, her cold fingers loosening just enough for John to wrench his arm free. He stumbled backward, his heart racing, as the ghost's form began to waver, her edges blurring in the moonlight. Her hollow eyes widened in surprise, her expression unreadable. And then, without warning, she was gone, vanished into the mist, as though she had never been there at all. John stood frozen, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The silence that followed her disappearance was deafening, the night around him suddenly too quiet, too still. But he knew better than to feel relief. The night wasn't over, and neither was his nightmare. Part 7. The Spirit's Wail. The cold that had seeped into John's bones from the ghost's touch was nothing compared to the wave of terror that washed over him now. His entire body trembled uncontrollably as he stood rooted to the spot, his mind desperately trying to process what had just happened. He had been so close to death, so close to being pulled into the endless void of the marsh, but somehow miraculously he had escaped. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sound cut through the suffocating silence of the night, a sound so terrible that it seemed to tear the very air apart. It started low, almost a guttural moan, but it quickly rose in pitch, becoming a scream, a wail of such pure, agonizing sorrow that John's legs gave out beneath him. His knees hit the wet ground with a sickening thud, but the pain barely registered. All he could focus on was the sound. The ghost, the woman whose cold fingers had nearly dragged him to his death, was still there, and her wail filled the night with a haunting, unearthly sound that seemed to resonate in John's very soul. The cry was raw, primal, the kind of scream that seemed to echo from a place beyond death, where pain and rage coalesced into something so deep and horrific that it defied understanding. John's entire body locked in place as the sound washed over him, his muscles tensing, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't even blink. His body was no longer his own, it belonged to the terror, the icy grip of fear that paralyzed him. And then, as if drawn by the sound, the ghost floated toward him once more, her form shimmering in the pale moonlight, barely more than a shadow wrapped in darkness. Her mouth hung unnaturally wide, far wider than a human mouth should be able to open. The wail poured from her gaping maw, distorting her face into something grotesque and inhuman. Her once pale features twisted into a nightmarish vision of grief and suffering, her eyes two black pits of endless sorrow, staring straight at him. John's chest tightened as her presence seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating, pressing down on him like the weight of 1,000 stones. He could feel the air grow colder, thicker, as though the very life around him was being sucked away, drawn into the endless void that was this woman's torment. Her wail got that sound. It felt as if it was inside him, vibrating through his bones, filling his head with nothing but that agonizing noise. His ears rang, his mind recoiled from the intensity of it. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, to do something, anything, but his voice was trapped in his throat. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make a sound. His lips wouldn't move, his vocal cords were frozen, locked in place by fear. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, beating faster and harder, as if it might burst at any moment. Each thud seemed to echo the agonized beat of the wail, synced in with it in a terrifying rhythm that seemed to draw him closer to her. The wail was pulling him in, dragging him deeper into her despair, and the closer she came, the more John felt his will to fight slipping away. She hovered just inches from him now, her cold breath mingling with the air around him, freezing the droplets of rain on his skin. He could feel her, could feel the emptiness of her existence, the void that surrounded her, pulling at him, threatening to swallow him whole. The air itself seemed to thicken, growing colder and denser with every breath he took, until it felt like he was trying to inhale her ice. Her mouth still hung wide open, the wail pouring from it like a torrent, as if the very essence of her agony was being funneled through that gaping maw. Her eyes, those hollow, black eyes, remained fixed on him, unblinking and cold, as though she could see right through him, into his very soul. John's mind spiraled into panic. He thought this was how it ended. There was no escape, no hope. He was going to die here, in this godforsaken marsh, consumed by the ghost's unrelenting wail. The thought of running, of trying to escape, barely crossed his mind anymore. He was too far gone, too deep into the abyss of fear to even consider it. His legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place by a terror so complete that it had taken over every part of him. His vision blurred as his eyes filled with tears, though whether they were tears of fear or from the sheer intensity of the wail, he couldn't tell. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his lungs burning from the effort. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. He couldn't escape the pull of her gaze, the pull of that endless void where her soul should have been. Please, John wanted to whisper. Please, no more, but no words came. There was nothing left but the wail. The ghost drifted closer still, her face now so near that John could see the faintest details of her features, the cracks in her pale skin, the hollow cheeks that made her look like she hadn't eaten in years, the dark smudges around her eyes that made her look like she was eternally trapped between life and death. And then, as if sensing his thoughts, the ghost's wail began to change. The pitch grew higher, more frantic, more desperate. The sound became almost unbearable, like nails being dragged across his brain, tearing at his mind, shredding his sanity. John could feel the pressure in his head building, growing more intense with each second, until he thought his skull might crack under the weight of it. The ghost's eyes widened as the wail reached its crescendo, her mouth stretching impossibly wide, her face contorted into a mask of rage and sorrow. Her hands shot out, reaching for him, her bony fingers curling toward his throat, as if she intended to drag him down into the same hell she inhabited. John's body jerked involuntarily as her fingers brushed against his skin cold, so cold that it felt like 1,000 tiny needles were being driven into him all at once. His throat constricted, his breath hitching in his chest as the cold spread through him like wildfire. But still, he couldn't move, he couldn't scream. The ghost's fingers tightened around his throat, her nails digging into his flesh with a strength that belied her frail appearance. Her eyes bore into his, her wail now a deafening roar in his ears, drowning out every other sound, every other thought. And then, without warning, she stopped. The wail cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound that it was almost worse than the sound itself. John's breath hitched, his chest heaving with the sudden absence of the noise. His ears rang with the aftershock, the phantom echo of the wail still bouncing around in his skull. The ghost stared at him, her eyes wide and unblinking, her grip still tight around his throat. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came from her now. It was as though the energy that had fueled her wail had been spent, leaving behind nothing but emptiness. For a brief, fleeting moment, John thought that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then, the ghost's lips curled into a twisted smile. Her eyes, once cold and empty, now glimmered with something dark and malevolent. Her fingers tightened around his throat, cutting off his air. As she leaned in closer, her breath cold against his skin. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, her voice a soft, hollow rasp. "The pain, the suffering, it's endless." John's vision blurred, the edges of his sight growing dark as the pressure on his throat increased. He tried to struggle, tried to break free, but his body refused to respond. The cold had seeped too deep into him now, freezing him from the inside out. The ghost's smile widened as she watched him struggle, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. Her grip tightened even further, and John's lungs screamed for air, his vision fading to black as the world around him began to disappear. But just as he thought he might slip into unconsciousness, just as he thought it was over, something shifted. The ghost's smile faltered. Her eyes flickered, the gleam of malevolence dimming for just a moment. Her grip loosened, and John gasped, his lungs flooding with air as he collapsed to the ground, coughing and choking. The ghost floated back, her expression unreadable, her eyes dark once more. For a moment she simply hovered there, watching him, as if unsure of what to do next. And then, without a word, she turned and drifted away, disappearing into the mist as silently as she had come. John lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The silence of the marsh was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He was alive. But the wail that sound still echoed in his mind, a reminder that the nightmare was far from over. He hadn't escaped. Not yet. Part 8. A fate sealed by terror. John fell hard into the wet, unforgiving mud, his body no longer obeying his commands. The cold, slick earth swallowed him, pulling him down as if the marsh itself had become an extension of the supernatural terror that had been hunting him all night. His hands, trembling and slick with rain and muck, tried to push him back up, but there was no strength left in his limbs. His muscles were frozen, his mind shattered, and the deep, suffocating weight of fear had settled into every fiber of his being. He was drowning in it, not in the physical sense, though the mud clung to his clothes, his skin, seeping into his very bones, but in the sheer, inescapable terror that had gripped his soul. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole, the dark expanse of the marsh pressing down on him from all sides, smothering his very existence. The wail was still there, circling him like a predator, gnawing at his sanity. It hadn't stopped. It had changed, grown softer and more insidious, weaving itself into the very air he was breathing, filling his lungs with despair. Each breath felt like a death rattle, shallow and labored, as though the air itself had turned to ice, freezing him from the inside out. John's heart pounded in his chest, erratic and uneven, his body betraying him with every thudding beat. His head spun, and his vision blurred with the onset of exhaustion and the overwhelming pressure building inside his mind. The night, once only eerie, had become a hellscape, a place where time and reality, bent under the weight of forces far beyond his comprehension, he had lost. He knew it. Every part of him, from the numbness in his fingers to the black cloud that had settled over his thoughts, screamed the same truth: there is no escape. Thought the ghost's wail intensified, no longer just a sound but a living, breathing entity that seemed to burrow into his brain, wrapping itself around his thoughts like a noose. It twisted and turned in his mind, scraping against the raw edges of his broken sanity, pulling him further into the abyss. His thoughts, once clear and determined, now unraveled like the tattered remains of a torn sail, whipped apart by the storm of fear that raged inside him. His mind began to fracture. The memories of the night, the boy, the rats, the woman's chilling, hollow eyes blurred together, mixing with the present horror in a nightmarish swirl. His grip on reality loosened, slipping through his fingers like the mud he was sinking to. Every sensation felt distorted, every sound warped, until it became impossible to tell what was real and what was not. The wail echoed again, sharper this time, as though it were calling to him, demanding him. John gasped, his body spasming involuntarily, his heart thudding violently in his chest as the sound pierced through his consciousness. His throat felt raw, as though he had been screaming for hours, but he couldn't remember making a sound. He wanted to scream now, wanted to cry out, but no words came. His voice had abandoned him, like everything else. All that remained was the terror, the oppressive weight of the ghostess' presence suffocating him as she drifted closer once more. She was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her form, half shrouded in the mist, flickered at the edges of his vision, never staying in one place for long. She was a shadow, a ripple in the fog, her presence so overwhelming that it filled the entire marsh. Every breath John took was filled with her. Every beat of his heart pulsed with the cold, unrelenting dread she carried with her. His hands clawed at the mud in a desperate attempt to pull himself free, but the earth seemed to cling to him, dragging him down as if it had become a living thing. The muck oozed between his fingers, thick and unyielding, trapping him in place. His legs twitched, the muscles spasming uselessly as he tried to move, but they wouldn't obey. His body had long since succumbed to exhaustion, and now it was simply a vessel for the terror that coursed through him. The ghost was near again. He could feel it, the oppressive cold that seemed to radiate from her, chilling the air around him until it felt like shards of ice slicing into his skin. Her wail softened, becoming a low, mournful hum that vibrated in his skull, a constant reminder that she was still there, still waiting for him to break completely. John's vision darkened at the edges, his consciousness slipping in and out of focus. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind, but it was useless. The darkness was closing in, creeping toward him like a shadow, blotting out everything else. The woman's face appeared before him, pale and spectral, her hollow eyes locking onto his. There was no humanity left in those eyes, just a deep, endless void that swallowed everything around it. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, her teeth bared in a silent snarl. The air around her shimmered, as if the night itself recoiled from her presence. John tried to pull away, tried to retreat into the safety of his own mind, but even that had been taken from him. He was hers now completely and utterly at her mercy. His body, his mind, his very soul had been consumed by the supernatural force that controlled her, and there was nothing left for him to hold on to. His head dropped forward, his chin hitting his chest as the last remnants of his strength drained away. His limbs went limp, his fingers loosening their grip on the mud. He could feel the cold seep deeper into him, the ice spreading through his veins, freezing him from the inside out. His heart slowed, the erratic beats becoming weaker, fainter, until they were little more than a whisper beneath his ribcage. The wail crescendoed once more, filling the night with its terrible sound. It was no longer just a cry of sorrow or anger, it was a death knell, a final, agonizing scream that signaled the end. John's breath hitched in his throat, his lungs burning as he struggled to take in air. His vision blurred, the edges darkening as the wail drowned out everything else. The world around him began to fade, the trees, the marsh, the sky, all of it disappearing into the void. He could feel her now. She was closer than ever, her cold breath brushing against his skin, her spectral fingers reaching out to claim him. John's mind fractured, the pieces of his sanity shattering like glass, leaving nothing but darkness in their wake. His last coherent thought, if it could even be called a thought, was a fleeting, desperate pleas, no more doubt, but there was no answer. There never had been. The wail echoed one final time, louder and more piercing than ever before, and then ... silence. John's body slumped forward, his face sinking into the mud, his eyes wide and unseeing. The cold, wet earth swallowed him whole, the marsh reclaiming him as one of its own. His fate was sealed, his mind and body broken by the terror that had consumed him. The ghost hovered over him for a moment longer, her whole eyes fixed on his lifeless form. Her expression was unreadable, her face pale and serene in the moonlight, as though she had found some semblance of peace in his destruction. And then, as silently as she had appeared, she drifted away, vanishing into the mist once more. The marsh was still. The fog curled lazily around the trees, the reeds swayed gently in the breeze, and the night sky remained cold and indifferent. There was no trace of the horror that had unfolded, no sign of the supernatural forces that had claimed John's life. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind, carrying with it the faintest echo of a wail lost to the night. John had never stood a chance. In the end, it wasn't the ghost that had taken his life. It was the terror, the unrelenting, all-consuming terror that had broken him long before the ghost had laid a finger on him. His fate had been sealed the moment he stepped into the marsh. Part 9. A terrifying discovery. The dawn broke over the village of Longbrook with a strange, eerie calm. The air felt thick with something unseen, an unshakable weight that made the villagers uneasy as they went about their morning routines. The storm from the night before had left the fields soaked, the roads muddy, and a dense fog still clung to the marshlands. The once vibrant sounds of roosters crowing and children playing were oddly absent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Among the villagers, there was a hushed concern John had not returned home. His wife, Ellen, had waited up all night, pacing back and forth, her heart sinking with every hour that passed without the sound of his familiar footsteps at the door. She had tried to convince herself that he was fine, that he had simply stayed out too long hunting frogs, and had found shelter when the rain became too heavy. But as the first light of day broke through the gloom, the pit in her stomach grew deeper, more suffocating. Something was wrong. By mid-morning, a group of villagers gathered, exchanging anxious glances. John wasn't the kind of man to disappear without a word. He had a strong sense of duty to his family, to his farm, and never lingered long on his nighttime hunts. With the folk still clinging to the marsh, the villagers felt a creeping dread settle in their bones as they set out to find him. As they trudged through the muddy roads leading out of the village, their breath was visible in the cold morning air. The marshland stretched out before them like an ocean of grey mist, the eerie silence amplifying the sound of their footsteps scorching through the mud. There was no wind, no birds, no sign of life, just the oppressive fog, twisting and swirling as if it held secrets too dark to reveal in the light of day. It wasn't long before they spotted something in the distance, an unnatural lump, half submerged in the mud near the edge of the marsh. At first they thought it might be some debris washed up by the storm, but as they drew closer, the shape became more defined, more human. It was John. One of the men, an old friend of John's named Henry, was the first to approach. His heart pounded in his chest as he bent down to get a better look. The sight that met his eyes froze the blood in his veins. John's body was contorted in ways that defied logic, twisted and bent in angles that no living person should be able to achieve. His limbs were splayed out awkwardly, his arms bent backward, his legs twisted unnaturally beneath him, as if he had been tossed aside by some great, unseen force. His clothes were soaked and covered in mud, but it wasn't the state of his body that truly horrified Henry. It was John's face. John's mouth was stretched wide open, frozen in a silent scream, as if his last moments had been spent in unimaginable agony. His eyes were wide and staring, fixed on something that only he could see, something that had terrified him beyond the limits of human comprehension. The whites of his eyes were bloodshot, the pupils dilated, and his skin was ghostly pale, a sickly contrast to the dark mud that clung to his form. Henry staggered back, his hand covering his mouth as bile rose in his throat. The other villagers gathered around, their murmurs of concern turning into gasps of horror as they saw John's twisted body for the first time. "Dear God," one of them whispered, crossing themselves instinctively. What could have done this? No one had an answer. There was no rational explanation for the state of John's body, no animal or accident that could have caused such gruesome injuries. His face told a story more horrifying than any physical wound ever could, a story of pure, unrelenting terror. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their shared fear growing heavier with every passing moment. They had all heard the stories, the whispered tales passed down through generations about the spirits that haunted the marshlands. Most of them dismissed those tales as superstition, nothing more than ghost stories meant to keep children from wandering too far from the village at night. But standing there, looking at the twisted, lifeless form of John, they couldn't deny the truth. John had fallen victim to something far worse than any wild animal or storm. He had been claimed by the spirits that roamed the marshlands, the restless souls of those who had met tragic ends, their anger and sorrow keeping them tethered to the land, unable to move on. Ellen arrived not long after, her face pale with worry, her heart hammering in her chest. When she saw the gathering of villagers, a cold dread washed over her. She pushed through the crowd, calling John's name, but when she reached the front and saw his body lying there in the mud, she froze. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her legs gave out and she collapsed to her knees, staring at her husband's body in stunned disbelief. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." Tears streamed down her face as she crawled toward him, reaching out to touch his hand, but the moment her fingers brushed against his cold, lifeless skin, she recoiled. His body felt wrong. It wasn't just the coldness of death, it was something deeper, something darker. Ellen looked at his face, her heart shattering at the sight of his wide, terrified eyes. She had never seen such an expression on him before. He had always been a strong man, calm and collected even in the face of danger. But now his face was frozen in an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, as if in his final moments he had seen something so terrible, so nightmarish, that it had broken him. The villagers stood in silence, none of them daring to speak, none of them knowing what to say. There was no comfort they could offer, no explanation that could make sense of the horror that had unfolded before them. After what felt like an eternity, Henry cleared his throat, his voice shaking as he spoke. We have to take him back to the village. He needs to be buried." But as they began to lift John's body from the mud, something strange happened. The fog, which had been swirling around them like a thick, suffocating blanket, seemed to shift. It wasn't just drifting aimlessly anymore, it was moving with purpose, circling around them as if it were alive. The air grew colder, and the faintest sound of a distant wail echoed through the marsh. The villagers froze, their eyes wide with fear. Did anyone else hear that?" one of them whispered, his voice barely audible. Another villager nodded, his face pale. "I heard it, like someone crying." A shiver ran down Henry's spine as the wail grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a cry, it was the same haunting wail that had driven John to his death. The same wail that had shattered his mind, leaving him twisted and broken in the mud. Ellen's sobs grew louder, her grief mixing with the eerie sounds of the marsh. But even in her despair, she felt it, the presence, the cold, unearthly presence that seemed to hang over them like a dark cloud. The spirits weren't done. The wail intensified, rising in pitch, filling the air with an unbearable sense of dread. The villagers, terrified and uncertain, began to back away from John's body, their instincts telling them to run. But there was nowhere to go. The marsh had become a prison, the fog closing in around them, thickening with every passing second. The realization hit them all at once. John's death wasn't an isolated incident. The marshlands were cursed, haunted by restless spirits that would not stop until they had claimed more lives. And as the villagers stood there, frozen by fear, they understood one terrifying truth: John had not been the first to fall victim to the marsh's restless death, and he would not be the last.